Hello. This is a recording for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, but as with all of these things previously, it's also up there for anybody who might be remotely interested in thinking about Carl Jung and his philosophies and his ideas. At the end of February, we're having our next online discussion meeting. If you would like the link, do shout and I'll email it across to you, where we are going to talk about the similarities and differences between Carl Jung's ideas and those of his former mentor, Sigmund Freud. So this is just a sort of a recording to start bouncing ideas around for that, to get people thinking and give us a bedrock to go from when we do meet for the discussion. So if we start with a key similarity, they both concurred on the idea of there being a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. For anyone not overly familiar with the terminology, the conscious mind is the waking part of ourselves. The bit of me that is talking to you now, hopefully, is awake. So that is the conscious mind. The sense of I, me, where the ego or ego, depending on how you want to pronounce it, primarily resides, my sense of who I am, and gives me a sense, Buddhists might say an illusion, but a sense of continuity between who I was yesterday or 5 years ago or 20 years ago, who I am today, who I hopefully will be tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years time. So it's that sense of self. The unconscious mind is the sleeping self, but even when I'm awake, the unconscious mind is still there, it's still bubbling away. Freud and Jung both agreed that the unconscious mind was very large and the conscious mind was the tip of the iceberg at the top, which may look big to us when we're conscious. We may feel our minds are quite big, but our unconscious mind is much bigger still. Now, the conscious mind, they both agreed, communicates fairly rationally, fairly logically. It is quite left brain, but depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed, of course. Anyway. We'll put the brain stuff aside for a minute. It's communicates in language, in words. It explains itself reasonably clearly, its needs, its wants, and so forth. The unconscious mind communicates more in terms of imagery, emotion, symbolism, metaphor. So it very rarely, some would argue never, says precisely what it means. It always conveys itself in some other capacity. For Freud, it requires a trained counsellor, a trained psychoanalyst, to intervene and explain our unconscious minds to us, because we are so enmeshed in the situation we can't really see the wood for the trees. We can't fully understand our own unconscious minds because we'll always, he felt, misinterpret it. So it needs that sort of outside expert to come in and say, well, what this really means, what this dream, what this image, what this painting you have produced from your unconscious mind, what this really means is blah, blah, blah. Jung, early on in his career, tended to largely agree with that, but as he grew older and moved away from Freud's influence, he became increasingly disenchanted with the idea that you need a person to intervene and explain things for you, that he came to the conclusion that people can reflect on themselves, reflect on their own dreams, if they're artists, on their own creative works, and come to understand themselves through self-awareness and self-reflection. In fact, he said that was vital in order to achieve individuation, in order to achieve this full integration of the psyche, is that we engage in self-understanding rather than that we rely on some other person to come along as the wise old man or the wise old woman and explain ourselves to us. If we keep relying on other people, that part of our psyche that is the internal archetype of the wise man, wise woman, is forever projected outwards onto whoever the therapist or the sage, whoever they are. We're not, in order to integrate and find the wisdom within, we need to kind of step back from that outside person, which is one of the reasons why he felt in a lot of mythology and cinema and literature and so on, where you do have a wise old figure like Dumbledore or Obi-Wan Kenobi, or people of that sort, invariably, spoilers, they die. So that the hero goes through a period of feeling abandoned and alone, and wondering how they're going to cope with life without the wise old what's it to steer them. But the loss of the external sage turns them within to realise that they have that wisdom, that knowledge, that understanding, the memory of all the clever things that the sage has said to them in the past. All of that is within themselves, and that ultimately the death of the external is a route to the integration of the internal, which is something, if we're thinking of differences, that's something that clearly Freud and Jung disagreed on, because Freud was certainly not advocating for the death of the therapist, whether literal or metaphorical. That he felt the analyst always had to be there to help the person in their route to self-understanding. Though the issue just mentioned there of individuation is again a key difference, Jung felt that we could, and indeed should, strive to achieve individuation, to achieve this fulfillment as well-rounded, well-integrated, well-balanced, healthy, mentally healthy human beings. Freud felt that life was a struggle of constantly sort of blundering on with wounds from the childhood and internal psychological problems, that you could get a bit better, overcome the worst of it, but that really you're never going to achieve this transcendental state of wisdom. You will always be limited by the problems within the unconscious mind, by the limitations of the damage done to the psyche, primarily at a very young age. So he had a bit of a kind of an optimist-pessimist contrast going on there in terms of where they felt the psyche could go towards, what the kind of the ultimate goal to achieve would be. Another, sticking with the conscious-unconscious, another marked difference is that Jung introduces the idea of the collective unconscious, which Freud regarded as a load of mumbo-jumbo, basically a load of nonsense. He felt that a lot of Jung's ideas, when they started to rift, that a lot of his ideas had become nonsensical. He'd kind of immersed so much in the mystical and the magical and the esoteric that he'd sort of, what would we say, gone native in a sense, and lost his scientific objectivity, his ability to step back. Whereas obviously Jung himself didn't feel that his immersion in the mystical was problematic. He felt that he was understanding something profound rather than losing something scientific and so forth. So the collective unconscious, again, for anyone less familiar with the terminology, is the is it a part of the mind? And this is an ongoing dispute. It's difficult to locate it in a specific region of the brain and say it's that bit there. That's the collective unconscious. Rather, it's a concept rather than something tied at a biological level. The idea that all human minds, and Jung focused on the human. From my perspective, I'd crank it up a bit beyond that, but never mind. We'll stick with what Jung said. All human minds alive right now, all human minds that have been alive in the past and have now died, and in potential, the human minds who have yet to be born and yet to come along, we are all interconnected. We are all part of each other in this sort of collective, what Doctor Who fans might think of as the Matrix, as all of the minds link together and tie together. And we are able to sort of slip in and out, kind of each other's ideas and thoughts and imaginations, and that our collective cultural experiences of religion and aspirations and social customs and dreams and family relationships and all sorts of things, they all mix and match and merge and come together in this kind of vast conglomeration of billions of human minds having experiences over tens of thousands of years, that we all link up, that we all interconnect. And so there are things which are within the unconscious mind that are personal to me, and there are things which are collective and cultural, which belong not specifically to me, but are shared with umpteen millions and billions of other people. and so we can move in and out of it. Now he has a sort of um, kind of an idea which is not fully clarified, I'd say, that there's almost like geographic regions within the collective unconsciousness. So at one point he talks about the spirit of Wotan moving through the Germanic consciousness, as if there's like a continent of Germanic consciousness, and by contrast, you could say, a continent of Chinese consciousness, of Spanish consciousness, of Dutch consciousness, of Zimbabwean consciousness, that there are regions of cultural consciousness that are specific to certain parts of the world and the people within it. It's not wholly clear from my understandings of what he said whether he is thinking of this as a genetic element. So if you are kind of genetically German, you'd be part of the Germanic consciousness, or whether it's more a case of upbringing. So somebody who, let's say, moved from, Belgium to go and live in Germany, or was born in Germany. Their parents came from Belgium and they were born in Germany, so their cultural background is perhaps Belgium in terms of parents, grandparents, etc., etc. But they're now living in Germany and growing up there and absorbing German culture. Would they also be part of the German collective unconsciousness, or is it more of a genetic thing that you have to have a certain bloodline and therefore kind of a notion that there is a genetic component to collective unconsciousness? I'm not sure quite how he's coming at that. So that there's an open area for debate there, perhaps some future discussion. But there is a sense of this collective unconsciousness, which, as I already said, Freud thought was absolute codswallop, a nonsensical idea as far as Freud was concerned. The distinction between the personal and the collective applies not only to individual experiences, but things like dreams. Sometimes I might dream within my personal unconscious, sometimes I might slip into the collective unconscious and have more archetypal dreams where I'm communicating with or contacting these vast archetypal forces that are part of the collective unconsciousness. So there's part of the job of the analyst is to kind of pick the differences and work out, is this dream personal, is this dream collective? Whereas for Freud, the dream is always personal. There is no such thing as a collective dream. It's just a non-idea. If we move on and talk a bit about the libido, they both agreed on the idea, the term libido, but they understood it in slightly different ways. So for Freud, the libido is primarily a kind of a combination of sexual and aggressive energies, a sort of flowing together between the powers of Eros and the powers of Thanatos as they move in and out of each other. We should say, even though both of them are very heavily influenced by classical culture, particularly Greek culture, and the utilization of names and terms from Greek mythology, to Freud these are just words to be applied to patterns of thinking, if I can quite put it like that. They are not specific to Greek consciousness, they're not specific to Greek culture, they're just kind of terms he's plucked out and said, oh, that will do, that will describe what I mean by this. I'm making it sound a bit more arbitrary than it actually is. He studied Greek myth and felt that the Greek myths were reflective of patterns of how the human mind works, which is kind of what Jung also thinks, that mythology reflects human experience. So mythology for both of them is less about the revealing the nature of gods and goddesses and more about revealing human nature, where the gods and the goddesses and the kings and the queens and the heroes and the whatnot become metaphors for human states of mind rather than reflections of something external and religious. But Jung allows a bit of both, whereas Freud is very much on the human inside of interpretation. So where Jung is using mythological names and terms and ideas, it's not simply and purely to label human experience, because he's also allowing that there are these archetypal forces who are, if not quite gods, at least very close to being gods. These profound powers that are autonomous of an individual person, because they exist within the collective, not within the individual personal psyche. And so they will act, they've been around for 100,000 years before I was ever born, and presumably will continue for 100,000 years after I'm dead and buried. So they're not linked to me as an individual, although I can experience them. But they're not born out of me, they're not contained within me. I'm just one tiny little water molecule going in and out of the great iceberg that is the archetypal forces. So that they for him, there is a sense in which the utilization of mythological terms and language is referring to beings, entities, forces external to the individual psyche. Um, you don't necessarily have to call them gods and goddesses, you can understand them in other ways, but they're kind of quite like gods and goddesses in that they are vast, practically eternal, at least compared to an ordinary human lifespan, and are able to have profound influences on thousands, if not millions, of people in one go. Like this idea of Wotan moving for the Germanic consciousness, it wasn't just affecting the odd one or two people here and there, it was affecting practically the entire German population as far as Jung was concerned. So there is this sense in which these archetypal forces acquire a vast power, which is not, when Freud is talking about the Oedipus complex, he doesn't think there is this entity out there called Oedipus. It's just a description for a stage that boys go through, rather than some externalized force. So there's that difference. So coming back to the libido, and him using these terms eros and thanatos, they're just terms to describe qualities and traits of the human psyche. He's not thinking of eros and thanatos as archetypal deity-like forces. But the libido is partly this kind of very sexualized urge which has the potential to create life, create bonds, forge bonds between people, and the aggressive urge which somewhat like, although Thanatos is primarily a death drive rather than aggression in a very broad sense, but the kind of, what should we say, the ultimate goal of where aggression heads towards, if it is unchecked, of course, is destruction, death, mayhem and chaos. So we've got those two qualities going on there for Freud in the libido. Jung agrees this term, libido, the idea of life force, of energy, but for him that psychic energy driving the psyche is not restricted only to sex or to aggression. It's perfectly capable of both, but it's also equally capable of all sorts of other things as well, like art and religion, and a variety of other forms of expression. So it's this very powerful force, of which sexuality and anger are aspects, as Freud suggests, but the difference is Freud says it is just anger and sex. Jung says it's anger and sex plus this, plus that, plus the other, these additional things. So the libido, the driving life force, can be stirred up by music, by art, by sex, by dance, by getting angry, by falling in love, by being filled with hope or filled with terror. It can manifest in a variety of different ways. And it can be both healing and destructive. So it has capacity to go in either direction, inside or outside. Other areas of agreement, they both have the sense of individualism, of things. The psyche moves in its own, for the most part, in its own field, and if you're a therapist, psychoanalyst, you are treating the individual. So it's not quite, for example, going down the routes that, say, Virginia Satir went down in the 60s and 70s and 80s and onwards, where she was looking at family therapy and saying, yes, this kid is a bit weird and strange, but their problems are not contained only within their own mind. Their problems are a manifestation of the family dynamic, and if the kid's screwed up, then de facto the rest of the family are screwed up, and in order to treat the child, you have to treat the family. You can't isolate one person from the social network that they're in. You treat all, or you're kind of wasting your time if you just try to treat them in isolation. Whereas Freud, to a large extent Jung, are treating people in isolation as therapy patients. So they are aware perhaps that there was stuff going on in the family and stuff going on at work or wherever else, but they're not attempting to treat the family members, they're not attempting to engage with the boss or the work colleagues or the other people who go to the church or the synagogue or the mosque or where it is that the community the person is part of, where there may be other people involved in contributing towards shaping the kind of problems that the individual lying on the couch is getting. They're just treating that individual in isolation. So there is that approach that they're both sharing that as a common pattern. Already mentioned the move towards individuation with Jung, that he puts a kind of a much bigger end goal on understanding the individual than Freud does. So there is no element of that. Now, having said earlier that Freud insisted on the need for a therapist and an analyst to step in and help explain the symbolism of the unconscious, nonetheless, both Freud and Jung engaged in extensive self-reflection. They kept diaries, they wrote down ideas reflecting on their own experiences, their own dreams, and so on and so forth. So for both of them, being aware of themselves and their own issues and where they were going in life and their memories of the past and how they interpreted themselves, and using their own life experience as a kind of template to understand the life experiences of other people, that's a common theme, a common approach for both of them. Now, focusing more now on key differences, Freud was very dismissive of Jung's idea of synchronicity. Again, he felt, as I said earlier, that this was all a bit of mumbo-jumbo nonsense, that Jung was just getting carried away with irrelevancies. Whereas for Jung, and just to clarify the term for, again, anyone unfamiliar with the jargon, synchronicity is where two events which are not cause and effect, nor are they correlated in the usual sense that social science researchers understand the notion of correlation. They are symbolically correlated. We could put it like that, symbolically correlated, rather than correlated in the usual sense of the term as to how researchers use that, in that it's correlated in the eyes of the individual looking at it, not necessarily in anybody else's eyes. So, trying to think of a random example. Okay, last night I was getting a lift home from work, and there's quite a lot of traffic, and there was a period where we were stalled in traffic waiting for the road ahead to clear, and the car immediately in front of the car of the van I was in had a number plate. Well, no surprise there. Of course, they had a number plate, but the number plate was the end part of it. I won't say the whole thing because that would obviously potentially reveal who was in that car. And I don't know, is that unethical? I don't know. Anyway, but part of it was 72DUA. To probably 99% of people sitting in their cars on that road that night, that is meaningless and irrelevant. Who gives a flying donut what the number plate in front of the car, in the car in front, is about? But DUA is the spelling used to transliterate the Egyptian word dua, which means worship, praise. You have to say dua, I praise you, I worship you. And 72 is a number heavily associated with Setech, sometimes also called Seth by the Greeks, the god of the desert, the ginger-haired god. So 72 DUA, 72 dua. Immediately I started thinking of Setech and dua, worshipping him. And I began to think, is this a subtle hint from him going, oi, you, ginger, do a ritual to me? And I'm still, obviously, the day after, it's still going through my mind. I'm still thinking, is this an indication? Now, of course, there were 1,000 cars on the road that night with 1,000 different number plates, most of which would have meant bugger all to me. It just so happened that the one in front at that period of time when we were stored and I was staring out the window at the rain coming down, and I noticed this number plate, and it took on a meaning to me. So that idea of synchronicity is that the meaning between event one and event two is in the eye of the beholder, in a sense. It's how you interpret it. It means something profound to you. Now, is it a mystical symbol from the cosmos or from some archetype or a deity or whatever? Well, clearly to me, that has the potential to be so, because I've just said, is this a message from Setek going, oi? So to me, that has a kind of a meaning, but Jung is not saying it definitely is. He's saying rather it becomes a route for the individual to connect to something vast and meaningful that helps make sense of their life, gives them purpose, gives them direction, particularly the sense of this synchronicitous linkage is prompting something. It's not just going, oh, and you go back to doing whatever you were doing in the first place. That meaning, that click of the synchronicity prompts you to do something. So it's pushing you ahead. And for Jung, it's pushing you ahead in a good way. So it doesn't kind of push you ahead to go and become a serial killer or something mental. Rather, it pushes you ahead to do something very meaningful to you that makes your life feel more fulfilled, more individuated, more purposeful. You are going in the right direction. And I know various people who've given me stories, anecdotal snippets from their lives, where they've been umming and ahhing, do I do this, do I do that, I'm not too sure what to do, and then something has happened and they feel like they're being given a message from whoever or whatever out there. Sometimes a deity, sometimes a deceased relative they feel is giving them a message. Kind of who it is perhaps less relevant than the idea that they feel they are being given some guidance which makes it clearer that if they're faced between a choice of A, B or C courses of action, they should go and do B or whatever. They should do that one because they've had some sort of symbol, omen, sign, call it what you will, which just makes everything fall into place for them. A person sitting next to them, seeing that event happen, it would be nothing to them whatsoever. But to that one person, it's going through their mind, do I do this, or this? Something happens that gives them the answer they're looking for. So that becomes a kind of synchronicitous event. To Freud, that's all just random codswallop. Shit happens, doesn't mean anything. But to Jung, it's a sign of the connection between the internal world of the psyche and the external world of the collective unconscious in which we live. As above, so below, as within, so without. And the two are in constant interaction with each other to make meaning and prompt growth, because we are all ultimately being egged along towards individuation. The universe is actively, as it were, wanting us to individuate. So it's not just a kind of series of random, meaningless, unconnected events. For Jung, there is a purpose. You could say that just as the individual psyche has its own libido that stirs it to eat, to drink, to procreate, to do all the necessary things for survival and perpetuation, so the cosmos has its own kind of libido, you could call it that, which is prompting the evolution of all of the things, not just me, but everything, everyone, everywhere, is being prompted in certain directions to do what they need to do to flower, to individuate. And there is that assumption, in psychology it's referred to as salutogenesis, the move towards health, that what is being prompted is positive, it's good in the greater sense. It's slightly limiting to talk of moral good in this context because that has slight other context to it, but it is for the greater good of everything to move in that direction. So it's not just random, nor is it destructive, like sort of Jack the Ripper getting the urge to go and bump somebody off. It's not that kind of leading a person into a terrible place. It's rather leading them into a good place, a positive prompt. All the talk of archetypes we've been bandying around so far, very Jungian idea, and again one that Freud thought was absolute twaddle. Yes, Freud talks extensively about the mother, to some extent about the father, Doesn't really talk about other relatives very much, doesn't have much to say about brothers and sisters and grannies and uncles and aunties and whatnot. That kind of came in with other people like Alfred Adler chipping in on the idea that sibling relationships are just as important as parental relationships for the development of the psyche. But as far as Freud was concerned, it's mum and dad and everything else is kind of meh. Those are the key influences on the development of the child's mind. Um, but to Freud, they are not archetypes in the way that they are to Jung. They are patterns, and an archetype is a pattern. So there's kind of similarities, but it doesn't attain the sort of cosmic significance that Jung attributes to the great mother, the great father. It's much more personalised, much more localised in the Freudian understanding of these kind of patterns within the psyche, that the child relates to mum this way and to dad that way. And for Freud, it is very much from the child. Early on, when he was a young man and developing his seduction hypothesis, he was allowing more the idea of these patterns going from the parent to the child, where the parent was the dominant force within that relationship. But later on, the focus on the individual is that it's all about the kid. And kind of what the parents actually do is less important than how the child interprets what the parents do. So it's the internal interpretation of the child is of greater weight than the objective actions, views, personal opinions, whatever, of the parents, for Freud, at any rate. So the archetypal issue is very Jungian and different from Freud's understanding and perspective. The issue of morality is worth a brief mention. For Freud, morality connects to the superego, or superego, however you want to pronounce it, the creation of consciousness as the internalized voice of the parents. And it has the positive and the negative. The positive, where parents say, oh, you must do this, you must do that, you must do the other, you must eat your dinner, you must go to bed on time, blah, blah. And the negative is all the do not. So it's a bit like the Ten Commandments. Some of it is thou shalt, and some of it is thou shalt not. And the thou shouts and the thou shalt nots come together to form the super ego, which is the internalized consciousness that directs the growing child and eventually continues to direct the adult once they become an adult. It is quite arbitrary as far as Freud is concerned. So the moral values that you internalize from your parents, it could be practically anything. It depends on culture, upbringing, the parents, etc., etc. But there is no kind of innate pattern to them. Although, having said that, he does skirt around this idea of cultural taboos around the death of parents, around incest, as being kind of universal taboos. So there is an element where he's kind of getting collective a bit, but it's still very, very much down to the arbitrary imposition of values and rules by the parents. Whereas for Jung, there are part of this kind of hallucinogenic idea, the movement towards collective individuation, good health, good mindset, etc. There are almost, I suppose we could call them archetypal values, morals, concepts that crop up in multiple cultures. And whilst obviously there are variations as to what's okay in that culture is not in another. One part of the world it's okay to eat pork, and in another part of the world it's seen as disgusting. Clearly there are variations between cultures, but Jung is arguing that underlying those fairly superficial differences, there is a sort of a universal human morality, which is not one arbitrarily imposed, but something that naturally bubbles up within the psyche. So for Freud, a child who has weak or absent parents would not have much of a superego at all. Whereas for Jung, it's a kind of an expression of something internal. So even if the parents are a bit weak, or they disappear into the great beyond, or whatever happens to them, even without them, there would still be a moral compass within the child, something that emerges and bubbles up and becomes a force for good, a force for productivity, because it helps us. And you could put this in the context of genetic evolution. that over the course of thousands and thousands of generations of humanity, we have developed moral predispositions hardwired into our genes, which are very good for survival. So even within very rationalist atheistic circles, Freud's explanation about the taboos around incest would concur with their point of view. Not that this is not so much a kind of aversion born out of religion or anything like that, but rather it is a deeply understood awareness that incest is not only emotionally damaging, exploitative and abusive and so forth, but that genetically it leads to a lot of weird inbreeding over the generations, and so it's not a good thing to do. So we've got a kind of a hardwired aversion to certain things because we have learnt in our ancestry, going back hundreds, thousands of years, that certain things are just not good to do, and so they're best avoided. So you get variations of interpretation. You could, to some extent, see what Jung is suggesting around this kind of commonality of morality as having an evolutionary function to it, as well as the more mystical function that he understands, the more sort of archetypal function that he's arguing. So you could kind of interpret it in either way. Another area of difference is the issue of dreams. So Freud was a great lover of the sort of dream dictionary format, that he was frequently giving advice both directly to his clients but also in the form of his writings, that if you dreamt about so and so thing it meant this, and if you dreamt about some other thing it meant that. So there's that kind of formulaic approach to interpreting the meaning of dreams within Freud's dream dictionary understanding. Whereas Jung, when he is interpreting dreams, tries to avoid formulaic interpretations. He's much more interested in a combination of personal dreams. What does this mean to you as an individual? And rather than you looking up the answer in a book, you have to sit back and think, well, I had a dream about a dog. What do dogs mean to me? And you kind of draw on your own understanding and interpretation of dogs. And other dreams, he says, the ones that shift more into the collective, where there you would be looking at more kind of cultural understandings. So in the culture I come from, how are dogs understood? That would help me to understand the meaning of the dog in my dream. So you kind of, some of it is archetypal, if it's that kind of cultural dream. Some of it is much more personal to the individual. Have they had good experiences of dogs or bad experiences? Do they love them? Are they scared of them? Etc. etc. A much more personalised element. So again, how do you interpret the language of the unconscious mind? For Freud, you can come up with a set of guidelines that would apply to pretty much anyone, and effectively give a symbol dictionary to somebody to understand, if this image crops up, it means that. And it's straightforward. Whereas for Jung, you can't really do that. You've got to go on an individualistic basis. And we're coming back to this issue of who is interpreting what, because when the Jungian is talking to a client about the dreams, you kind of turn it back onto them and say, what does that mean to you? In other words, they have to interpret their own dreams. If it's archetypal, you can say to them, well, in this culture, in that mythology, that image commonly means so and so, but you still come to the point of then saying, what does that mean to you? Rather than saying, well, the book says, therefore, this is what it means, like it, lump it, boom, off you go. So there's a kind of a different approach to the understanding of dreams on that front. I mentioned the Oedipal syndrome earlier. Freud, very big on the Oedipal syndrome, the little boy who obsesses over their mother, wants to possess the mother body and soul, and resents the father as getting in the way, wants to kill the father and get him out of the way. And the flip side of that, when the genders are reversed for the Electra complex. Jung was interested in that as a young man when he was still very much within the influence of Freud. He was his devoted pupil. But as that rift began to develop and they began to move away from each other, Jung felt there was less and less value to this Oedipus phase that children went through, and began to question, was it really as universal as Freud thought it was? Was it more specific maybe to certain individuals? Had Freud really understood it properly, and eventually he kind of pretty much ditches the Oedipal complex as an idea and the Electra complex by extension. So that kind of is another separating of the ways. Cracking, talking for quite a long time there. So to draw it to a close, we've already mentioned that Freud largely thought Jung was going kind of losing the plot a bit by going into all the mysticism and the nonsense, as from his perspective, nonsense. Not only was he feeling that in respect to things like archetypes and synchronicity and so on, but Jung, quite early on, had developed a fascination for what we might loosely call the paranormal, the occult, kind of magical stuff in a very broad sense. So he had a relative who worked as a clairvoyant medium, and he did a study of her and was fascinated by that. And his way of understanding and interpreting the mediumistic experiences from Freud's point of view, again was nonsensical, missing the point. And so he saw all sorts of things like Freud. This is telepathy, telekinesis, all of that. He just thought, oh, what a load of rubbish! Doesn't happen. It's just nonsense. Just people talking twaddle. Whereas Jung was much more open. I won't say he believed wholeheartedly in absolutely everything, because that's an exaggeration, but he was much more open to the idea that some, at least, of these things might happen, might exist, could be understood and studied, and slotted in to his overarching ideas of the personal and the collective unconsciousness and the power of the unconscious to achieve things and make strange, weird things happen. So one quite open, the other shut off to it as just dismissed it as an irrelevance. But I think that's probably quite enough to be getting on with as far as the end of the month discussion group is concerned. So I'll leave that there. And I say, if you would like to take part in the discussion, give me a shout and I'll send you the link to the Teams meeting for it. And if you don't want to take part or you're not available to take part, then perhaps just leave a comment with this video, bits you agree with, bits you disagree with, questions you might have that I can have a crack at answering, and we can explore the ideas further. Thank you.